So thanks very much for these kind introductions, Beryl, and thanks also all for the great turnaround over here. It's really exciting to be here because I've presented this systematic review in London, I've presented it in Washington, D.C., I've presented it in Manila, I've also presented it in Bangladesh, but I've not yet been able to present it in the epicenter of self-help group activity in the world, namely India. So it's really nice to be here to actually talk about a systematic review on self-help groups. And of course, I cannot start without first also thanking my co-authors, Karen Brody of Truro University, who is the other co-principal investigator, Martina Wojtkova, also from TRIAE, I should say formerly TRIAE, she recently took a new job, as well as several other authors from across the world, from all kinds of other universities. It's a very diverse team with which we're working on this systematic review about women's self-help groups. So I'm just going to start with giving a really brief introduction about what women's self-help groups are. And I'm sure that like 90% of the audience here has some idea about women's self-help groups are, and probably some of you probably have a much better idea about women's self-help groups than I have, specifically those working on the implementation of these programs. But if you think about it, it's like about women's self-help groups, it's this really holistic concept. And at the it is both part of the Women's Self-Help Group program, that it is so holistic, so it can be quite flexible to programming. At the same time, this makes it very hard to also do a systematic review about this topic, because you have so many diverse women's self-help groups, and of course there's some basic canonical model wherein women save and receive training about women's rights, and as a result they can gain access to credits with which they can, for example, buy assets. But there are so many other different elements of women's self-help groups as well. And at the same time, yeah, that makes it really hard to do a systematic review also about this topic. But we came up with a couple of joint characteristics of women's self-help groups. First of all, like the name says it all. It's women's self-help groups. Female participants come together. There are women's self-help groups where men also join. Oftentimes that's not the case. Increasingly that's the case. Or there are separate men's groups within the village as well. But in general, what we saw in the literature, participation of men is not often discussed when it comes to women's self-help groups. For a systematic review, we took the liberty of coming up with this definition of economic self-help group programs. Like, we needed to focus on some specific elements and some specific women's self-help group program. So we're focusing on those that receive an economic intervention. So that's part of the canonical self-help group model wherein women save and they receive credit at some moment, but it could also be an enterprise or a livelihoods intervention wherein women receive business training. And like, this is basically how it looks like. Female participants come together, possibly discussing women's rights issues, possibly also discussing issues related to nutrition and how to raise and how to make sure that their children get a good education. Like, it's really diverse, these women's self-help groups. At the same time, they all have the goal of actually focusing on women's empowerment in the end. And don't worry, I'm going to talk about women's empowerment and how we define that later. So, but let me first just start. For those of you who really have to leave in 5 minutes with the results of this systematic review. And the results really show that we do find positive effects on women's economic, social, and political empowerment. So with women's economic empowerment, I will dive deeper in that in some moments, but basically we're talking about women's bargaining power in the household when it comes to economic decisions. Oftentimes this relates to survey questions, for example, about whether women have decision-making power about specific expenditures. It could be all kinds of expenditures. It's quite diverse how authors measure it. It could be jewelry, it could be health expenses, it could be education expenses, etc. And basically there are all kinds of survey questions that have been developed for this. In addition, we also find positive effects on social empowerment. When I talk about social empowerment, we're talking about women's mobility, for example, but also women's family decision-making power about the family size. So it's again quite diverse, and we actually distinguish between these two quite different components of social empowerment also in the systematic review. So we find both positive effects on women's mobility as well as on women's decision-making power about family size. And finally, we also find positive effects on political empowerment. Like, that's oftentimes just defined as voting or being able to participate in elections, for example. So one other finding is maybe not surprising for you, but at the same time it's a less positive message, and that's that the poorest of the poor often do not participate in self-help groups. So even though women in that category could potentially benefit from women's self-help groups in terms of economic, social, and political empowerment, oftentimes what we find in this systematic review is that they usually do not participate in women's self-help groups. Then there's some talk also about women's self-help groups and how potentially women's improvements in women's empowerment could actually also lead to adverse effects on intimate partner violence or domestic violence. Fortunately, we do not find evidence for this during this systematic review. At the same time, there are only very few studies that actually focus on this topic. So it seems that there is definitely an evidence gap in this area when it comes to estimating the effects on intimate partner violence, because there are only very few rigorous studies that focus on this topic. Similarly, on psychological empowerment, we also do not find evidence for positive effects there. So this is really just a short summary of what we find during this systematic review. I will go deeper into all of this in a later stage as far as possible. So before I start, let me then first give you a really short overview of what I'm going to talk about right now in this presentation. We will just start with the evaluation questions, followed by a short overview of an initial theory of change that we developed for the systematic review. And for this theory of change, what we did was, one of the goals of this systematic review, in addition to the results, was to also further develop this theory of change on the basis of the evidence, so that in the future, both programming organization, implementing agencies, as well as researchers can make use of this, of this theory of change that was developed on the basis of this systematic review. I will also, like many of you may have heard the word systematic review for the first time, I will also give a short overview of what that actually means, a systematic review in terms of methodology. I will talk about quantitative analysis as well as qualitative analysis in the systematic review. Because in contrast to what many other systematic reviews do, this systematic review includes both quantitative studies and qualitative studies. So that in addition to assessing the effects of women's self-help groups, we can also better understand why they have these effects. Finally, I will come up with some synthesis where we come back to the further developed theory of change and a conclusion. So these are basically the evaluation questions where we're looking at. Like the first is a really traditional systematic review question, like maybe not in the sense of a clinical trial where systematic reviews originally come from, like where we ask what is the effect of this specific treatment on this specific health outcome, but still a more holistic concept, like what is the impact of women's economic self-help groups? So those include those that focus on credit, savings, and livelihood programs, on individual women's empowerment in low and middle income countries. So we're not looking at collective empowerment in this case, also because just many studies do not focus on this topic. In addition to that, the more qualitatively oriented research question that we're looking at, a much less traditional systematic review question is like, what are the perspectives of female participants on factors determining their participation in and benefits from women's self-help groups? And I will dive deeper into what kind of quantitative and qualitative studies we include at a later stage. So this is the theory of change we initially developed, and I'm sure that you can probably not read it. So I will just look at this in somewhat more detail right now, but I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to focus more attention on the theory of change that we developed on the basis of the systematic review. But basically where it comes down to is that there are several mechanisms through which a self-help group program could eventually lead to positive effects on women's economic, social, psychological, and political empowerment. And the first thing is just access to resources. Like, that's really the economic factor that comes into place. If women gain access to resources, whether it's through savings or through credit, they can potentially gain in terms of bargaining power in the household. Possibly, if you have some savings, you can keep them for yourself. You can potentially really use those savings for things that benefit yourself, as opposed to possibly a situation where you don't have that bargaining, where you do not have those savings, and where potentially your husband may have a much larger decision-making power in the household. Second of all, it's really the coming together part by itself could also possibly lead to women's empowerment through several mechanisms. For example, through increases in social capital. Possibly, if you join together with women and you talk with each other about women's rights, and you hear different perspectives about how these women's rights can be achieved, and how you can potentially also gain in terms of bargaining power in the household, you really can make sure that as a result of this increase in social capital, possibly women gain in terms of women's economic, social, and psychological and political empowerment as well. And finally, it's also just like the talking itself, possible facilitation by others that basically facilitate discussions about women's rights without interaction of the women itself. So these are just 3 elements, and there are many more mechanisms through which this could happen, but this is really a basic theory of change that I would like to start with. So then, and I already know that my discussant is probably going to talk about this, because she comes from the measurement unit of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I'm sure that I'm glad that I don't have to explain myself why specific authors have chosen to measure women's empowerment in specific ways, because there are very diverse ways in which women's empowerment can actually be measured. Like I was already talking about women's bargaining power, which is really specifically related to economic empowerment in our conceptual framework, wherein women really gain in terms of financial decision making. Like as a result of them having possible access to more resources, or as a result of discussions with other women, but eventually they can make more decisions about expenditures, possibly as a result of women's self-help groups. And that could eventually also lead to other benefits, which we do not cover in the systematic review. For example, if women really have, women could, for example, make decisions that could influence positively the nutrition outcomes of their children or the education outcomes of their children. So indirectly, this could lead also to all kinds of other benefits through the channel of women's economic, social, and psychological empowerment. Then there's social empowerment. Many questions that are being asked here are about whether women are, for example, allowed to go to the market without their husband's permission, or whether they are allowed to go to the doctor without their husband's permission. Like these are the usual questions that are often asked when it comes to women's mobility as one element of social empowerment. And in addition to that, there are also like similar questions to economic bargaining power that focus on decision making about women's family size decision making, like are you able to make decisions about condom use in the household, for example, or whether they actually have the number of children that they also wanted to have due to their preferences, as opposed to, for example, their husbands determining the number of children that they have. Then there's political empowerment, which often just focus on whether women vote. In those cases where political empowerment is measured, because we only found very few studies that actually do measure women's political empowerment. Finally, we also focus on psychological empowerment, which really is about feelings of autonomy, confidence, self-sufficiency, oftentimes measured through Likert scales, 5 points, like how confident are you about specific decisions that you're making, or how much bargaining power do you have, or for example, also how confident are you about your life? Also, it also relates, for example, to subjective well-being, like how happy are you with your life in general. So these are some of the ways in which psychological empowerment is also measured. So what is then a systematic review? So any one of you who has never encountered a systematic review in their life before, maybe I don't have to even explain this, I'm not entirely sure. Well, I will still explain it, even though everybody in this audience knows what a systematic review is. So in short, it comes down to a systematic critical appraisal of the literature. And we follow the definition of Waddington et al. From 2012 in Journal of Development Effectiveness. Probably well known to many of you because it's a 3IE supported journal, and Mr. Waddington also works in the London 3IE office. And basically what we're doing here is, when we talk about systematic, we're really talking about that we ex ante, or before the start of the research, develop a search strategy and develop inclusion criteria for what kind of studies we do include and what kind of studies we don't include. So many of you may think, based on the medical literature, that solely focuses on randomized control trials. So that's one possibility for a systematic review. Like many clinical trials that focus on the effects of some specific treatment, on the effect of some specific health outcome, really focus this protocol where they only include randomized control trials with a placebo in the control group. Well, in the international development literature, of course, there are, first of all, much fewer randomized control trials going on. At the same time, it's also much more difficult to adopt randomized control trials, and possibly as a result, there are much fewer randomized control trials around, and you don't want to exclude the quasi-experimental evaluations. So for this systematic review, what we did, we include both experimental or evaluations or randomized control trials, or quasi-experimental evaluations that include a comparison group that is not randomly determined. So, and in addition to that, we also include a lot of qualitative research as well. We'll talk about that more, but basically that serves to really focus on the second research question about the perspectives of female self-help group members. So for the quantitative research, at least, we really focus on studies that try to address a counterfactual question. So what would have happened in the absence of the intervention? And that could be either addressed through an experimental evaluation or a randomized control trial, where a self-help group program is randomly assigned to a specific group of people, or quasi-experimental evaluations where we do have a comparison group, for example, based on propensity score matching or regression discontinuity design, but the comparison group is not randomly determined. And we also include multivariate regression studies, wherein we have as an outcome variable women's economic empowerment or women's social empowerment, and we regress that outcome variable on the treatment or the benefits from the women's economic self-help group program, plus a number of other variables. So you may think then that this is a wide variety of rigorous, maybe less rigorous, and maybe not so rigorous designs that we include together. And in the remainder of this presentation, I will discuss a little bit more about how we distinguish between the effects that we find in these rigorous studies, these less rigorous studies, and these potentially not so rigorous studies. And in that, we don't only consider whether they are randomized control trials or quasi-experimental evaluations, but also, for example, risk of spillovers and risk of outcome analysis reporting bias. So, in contrast then to many other systematic reviews, we also include qualitative studies. And I think it's fair to say there's a lot less consensus about what constitutes good qualitative research as to what constitutes good quantitative research to address counterfactual questions. So when it comes to addressing like women's perspectives though, what we do for the qualitative research is we include qualitative studies that include quotes of the beneficiaries of the program to make sure that we really capture the perspectives of these female self-help group members. And in this way, we really can get to not only whether economic self-help group programs have a positive effect, but also why that is the case and how potentially these programs can be improved, for example, in different parts of the theory of change. And we include these kinds of qualitative studies, in-depth interviews, ethnography, and focus groups. And in addition to that, this qualitative research also needs to have some evaluative question. So it needs to make some judgment about whether a program worked or not. So we don't include all qualitative research here. We also have some rules about what kind of qualitative research we include and what we don't. So in the end, when we come with all of these rules and this systematic critical appraisal of the literature, we include 23 quantitative studies and 11 qualitative studies that we encountered. And as I told you, we judge the quality of this research based on a really thorough reading of all of this literature. And we focus on 4 elements. And I will explain later what those are. But selection bias, performance bias, outcome and analysis reporting bias, and other biases. So selection bias is probably the most well known to all of you, as in like possibly the comparison group is not comparable to the treatment group because they either self-select into the program or there are specific rules that the implementing agency has that ensure that the comparison group is not comparable to the treatment group. And what we find is that approximately only 14% of the studies that we include, so of those 23 studies, actually have a low risk of selection bias based on these kinds of criteria. So basically, when we say a low risk of selection bias, we say randomized control trials with a sample size that is sufficient to detect small but meaningful effects of the intervention. The quasi-experimental evaluations we did not disregard immediately as low risk of selection bias, but we found sufficient problems with them to have some doubts about the validity, about whether these studies could really address counterfactual questions. Like propensity score matching, it was possibly biased through unobservable characteristics. There was self-selection into the program, for example. There were no regression discontinuity designs, et cetera, et cetera. And when we think about high risk of bias, we really think about either studies that use an objective, like an instrumental variable analysis where the instrument is really probably not exogenous, or, for example, ordinary least squares regression analysis. And this is all based on methodology. Performance bias, and there we also find that 24% of the studies have a low risk of performance bias. When we think about performance bias, we really think about risk of spillovers. Like, there have been a number of studies about self-help groups that focus on the impact of self-help groups by comparing beneficiaries with non-beneficiaries in the same village. The problem here is that those non-beneficiaries in the same village could potentially also benefit from women's self-help groups because they learn about women's economic empowerment from the self-help group members. So as a result, the comparison group is contaminated and the impact of the intervention may be underestimated. Then there's outcome reporting bias, which generally refers to either authors not reporting specific results, probably because they don't find significant effects. I mean, we all know the glorious feeling of having a 95% confidence interval and a statistically significant effect. And yeah, we all also know that journals generally really prefer those types of publications over studies that do not find statistically significant effects. So there are several authors that only report statistically significant effects, which could lead to an overestimate on the impact on empowerment. And finally, we talk about other biases. For example, wherein people collect baseline data through recall, and they ask the women, were you more empowered 4 years ago than now, for example? This could potentially, of course, lead to social desirability bias because those women may, in the end, under-report their empowerment in the past and over-report their empowerment in the future. So these are things we focus on. And we do separate analysis for studies with high risk of selection bias, high risk of, and low risk of selection bias, and medium risk of selection bias. For the qualitative studies, we do the same. Because of time constraints, I'm not going to focus so much on those right now. But basically, those focus really on recruitment of participants, data collection tools, data saturation, the researcher-participant relationship, and the data analysis. One thing to consider here is that approximately only 40% of the qualitative studies actually include a sufficiently enough discussion about data analysis to be considered low risk of bias in that specific category. So the qualitative studies, there's not a lot of reporting about methodology, and as a result, it's unclear how strong the methodology is, actually, in many cases. So what do we find? And for that, we use a meta-analysis approach. So we pull together these studies that focus on women's, in this case, economic empowerment, and we look at the average effect across these studies weighted by the variance in the impact estimates. So this is really something where studies with a lower standard error in the estimates, they receive a higher weight in the analysis. What we find when we only include randomized control trials, the first study, we find that potentially there could be an effect of women's economic self-help groups on women's economic empowerment, but it just falls outside the 95% confidence interval. So minus 0.01 still is included in the confidence interval when we do a meta-analysis that focuses on women's economic empowerment. So either there is no effect, or potentially, because of the limited number of randomized control trials, we only found 4 of them, there's not enough statistical power to actually detect a small but meaningful effect of women's economic self-help groups on economic empowerment. So the confidence interval, we find an effect of 0.22 standardized mean differences on average. So for family size decision making, we actually find a very similar thing. Namely, we find an average effect of 0.13 standardized mean differences. But again, like the confidence interval of 95% also includes an effect size that falls below 0. So again, we don't find statistically significant effects. So if we would have only included randomized control trials in this systematic review, we would now conclude that there's no evidence for positive effects of women's economic self-help groups on economic empowerment and family size decision making, at least not on average. But that's if we would only include randomized control trials. So let's now dive a little bit deeper into this. Like what we did is we distinguished between the effects of randomized control trials, quasi-experimental studies with a medium risk of selection bias, and quasi-experimental studies with a high risk of selection bias. So first, quasi-experimental studies with a high risk of selection bias. So studies that are actually not able to address counterfactual questions in a rigorous manner. We find an effect size, and you cannot see that here, but that's approximately like 3 times as high as the effect size that we find for randomized control trials. Based on that conclusion, based on that evidence, we actually conclude that it's very likely that these studies with a high risk of selection bias overestimate the effect of women's self-help groups. Because they're not, women are probably more motivated to join self-help groups, and as a result, they are already empowered before the program starts. And at the same time, medium risk selection bias studies, we can actually not distinguish between the effects of randomized control trials and proper quasi-experimental evaluations that use a rigorous method, such as propensity score matching, to assess the effects of women's economic self-help group programs on women's economic empowerment. And actually the effect is even slightly lower, although not statistically significant, than for randomized control trials. So based on that, we conclude that we can pool studies with a medium risk of selection bias, quasi-experimental studies, and randomized control trials. And even though the effect size on average is lower, we find statistically significant effects. So based on this, we do actually find evidence for positive effects on economic empowerment. And this is very similar for mobility, as well as for family size decision-making power. We do not find evidence for positive effects on psychological empowerment, though. So how can we actually explain all of this is, of course, then the question, like, what are the mechanisms that are taking place through which self-help group programs can actually improve women's empowerment? So we look at that, we do a rigorous qualitative analysis for this, and we look at the risk of bias of qualitative studies, and we weigh the evidence that is higher, that is lower risk of bias for the qualitative studies. And based on that, we find that for economic empowerment, like one possible mechanism through which this happens is women report feeling empowerment after handling financial transactions. So just a mere fact of them actually having some money and being able to actually make some expenditures with that money makes them feel economically empowered, is the conclusion from several quotes from the qualitative research. Social empowerment seems to run actually the effect through the support in the self-help groups, with women coming together. So this is consistent with the theory of change, wherein women actually come together, and as a result, they really feel empowered in a social manner. So mobility and financial and family size decision making could potentially be, the positive effects could potentially run through this mechanism of women report that feeling mutual support in their groups. And for intimate partner violence, like, we don't find effects on domestic violence. And the qualitative research suggests that that could be because although initially after increases in women's empowerment there is an increase in violence, eventually they gain respect from their husbands for becoming empowered, and as a result violence decreases again, and as a result women's self-help group programs do not have positive long-term effects, or do not have adverse effects on women's on domestic violence. So some other conclusions from the qualitative research. We find limited participation of the poorest, and the qualitative research suggests that that's because they're either too financially constrained for participation, so they just have to work, for example, in agriculture, or there's caste or class discrimination going on within these groups, and as a result, the poorest of the poor can actually not join these self-help groups. So when we think about this for the theory of change, specifically about this last point, about the poorest of the poor not being able to join self-help groups, like really what we need to do is probably look at the assumptions underlying the theory of change. And this is really about the very start of the self-help group, even before the self-help group actually is implemented, and the way this self-help group is introduced. So before the poorest of the poor actually can join women's self-help groups and potentially benefit from this, the husband and the mother-in-law actually need to approve of participation. And the women also need to have knowledge about and time for participation. And there needs to be no class and caste discrimination. So this is potentially something that policy makers could look into. Like if they want to also focus on women's empowerment for the poorest of the poor, they first need to resolve these kinds of constraints before they can actually make sure that the poorest of the poor gain also through through self-help group programs. And based on that, we come with a revised theory of change. And like the big change that we make is actually really about the start of the program. It's not so much about the implementation of the self-help group program itself, possibly, how the poorest of the poor can actually gain gain increases in women's empowerment. Instead, there needs to be some programs in place that actually make sure that the poorest of the poor can actually participate in women's self-help groups. Of course, like there's some trade-off here. Like, of course, policymakers may be less concerned about women's economic empowerment for the poorest of the poor because there are resource constraints. Like possibly, it's also possible, for example, that maybe we should focus first on cash transfers for this group of people, for example, instead of introducing these programs that focus on participation self-help groups. Or possibly we need to focus first on nutrition before we can make sure that these people come into women's self-help groups. But for that, we probably need to know more about the impact of these programs at the beginning of the causal chain of the theory of change, and about the cost effectiveness of these programs. And that's one of the problems also from many of these impact evaluations. We actually don't find any impact evaluations that also include cost effectiveness measures. So this is really a gap in the literature when it comes to women's self-help group programs. Like we do find positive effects on empowerment, but we don't know how much it costs to actually achieve those benefits. So then, of course, there's also like what exactly in these self-help group programs make sure that these programs do have benefits on empowerment. Like what we do find is that programs that only focus on microfinance and do not include any training, those programs do not show any positive effects on empowerment. That may be because of statistical power, but it may also be that possibly training is really the key component in these self-help group programs that make sure that empowerment is happening. The problem though, and like I think I'm going to almost finish with that, is that the type of training is often really a problem, as in it's not being reported in these studies. Many times these studies, they say that some kind of training happened, even though you have to often look in the footnotes of the studies. But we don't know what kind of training is actually happening. Is it health education? Is it entrepreneurial skills? Is it women's rights training? We don't actually know what kind of training leads to women's empowerment. So these are just some key lessons that I already introduced at the beginning as well. We find positive effects on economic, social, and political empowerment. We find no evidence for adverse effects on intimate partner violence. And the poorest of the poor do often not participate in self-help group programs. And I think for policymakers, these are probably like the main lessons. Like we find positive effects, But when it comes to real cost effectiveness, we don't know a lot about that. So whether we really need to scale these programs on the basis of cost effectiveness, we just don't know that. That's a gap in the evidence at this moment. Self-help groups may also be improved by stimulating the poorest to participate. And although I'm here in India, like in the end, like many of these self-help group programs, the evidence that we find, the findings are almost solely applicable to South Asia. We almost don't find any evidence from Sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe that's also not such a big problem. Like in the end, when we're talking about external validity, it's all relative. We're with quite a few people here in South Asia. So even if it's only applicable to about 50% of the world population, I don't know whether that's really a problem. So this was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks.